Good afternoon, and thanks so much for coming. It has been my great honor to serve as the president of ASEH for the last 2 years. I thank you for that privilege. I also thank you for attending Environmental History Week by watching this presentation. Presidential addresses to academic societies tend to fall into one of two genres. One genre is scholarship. The president talks about his or her research. The other genre is professional. The president talks about the status of the profession. COVID made my presidency unusual, unique even, and so it's perhaps appropriate that I plan to have an unconventional presentation as well. I plan to combine those two genres and introduce more personal dimensions than are typical in presidential addresses. The topic of my address is a coevolutionary history of COVID-19. I am dedicating this talk to all of those who have died of COVID-19. At this point, we're well above 550,000 deaths, closing in on 600,000. COVID-19 is now the second deadliest epidemic since the founding of the United States, second only to the flu epidemic of 1918, 1919. Behind every one of those deaths is a life, an individual person with their individual story, their own history. I want to describe to you one of the people killed by COVID as a symbol for all of those who have been victims of the pandemic. The person I want to talk about is Donald Kennedy. He participated in our field by publishing an article in the journal Environmental History titled Rubber, Blight, and Mosquitoes, co-authored with Marjorie Lux. But his career was much broader than environmental history. He was a biology professor at Stanford. Then he became the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. He returned to Stanford to become provost and then the president. I got to know him during that phase of his career. I worked in the president's office at Stanford between college and graduate school, so he was my boss. After the presidency, Kennedy became editor of Science magazine, and he also worked to advance environmental policy. He was the Bing Professor of Environmental Science and Policy at Stanford. So here we have an individual who was a scholar, a leader, a public servant, and someone dedicated to environmental protection. So I think he is an excellent example of the many people that we want to remember. In today's talk, I want to cover several topics. I want to begin by clarifying what I mean by coevolutionary history, then move on to the topic of niche construction. From there, I'll turn to the COVID case. I'll talk about how COVID has sparked biological evolution, especially in antibodies and neurodiversity, and then argue that we need cultural evolution to become more welcoming of neurodiversity. A lot of the theoretical framework that I will describe today, I worked out in this book, Greyhound and Nation, a coevolutionary history of England, 1200 to 1900. I talked about evolutionary history in another book. In thinking about a subsequent book, I wanted to do two things. One was to think more about coevolution, and I'll talk about the difference in a moment, but I also wanted to use one breed of plant or animal to dig deeply into coevolution and see how it worked. So that's what this book is about. But it's not primarily about greyhounds, it's primarily about how human and non-human populations have co-evolved. So what is coevolutionary history? To understand that, we first need to define evolution. Evolution means change in the frequency of a trait in a population. It could be any kind of trait. It could be a physical trait. It could be a behavioral trait. It could be a trait under genetic control. It could be a trait influenced by culture. Any kind of trait frequency change is evolution. Coevolution is a subset of evolution. It's a particular type of evolutionary process. Coevolution happens when two or more populations evolve repeatedly in response to each other. So population A affects the traits of population B, and those traits circle back to affect the traits of population A. So that's coevolution. Dogs are a great study to use for coevolution. Here you see an image of a coursing meet in the early 19th century in England. Coursing meets were contests in which aristocrats and the gentry used greyhounds as gambling instruments. They would release two greyhounds to chase hares. The participants had, meaning the human participants, had complex rules for determining which greyhound performed better in chasing the hare. They would bet on the outcome following these rules. So what do you have? You have a clear impact of people on dog populations. People shaped greyhounds in a particular way to make them good at chasing hares. Those traits are different than they encouraged in dogs that were fighting dogs, for example. Greyhounds looked and behaved differently. So there was a population with certain traits that people aimed for. But in return, the greyhounds shaped human evolution, not in any genetic way, probably. There's certainly no way that I could determine, but they affected the evolution of people culturally. They changed human behavior by making it possible for people to behave in certain ways that they would not have been able to behave without the greyhounds. The greyhounds made it possible to bet on coursing contests, and people took advantage of that opportunity. A behavioral trait, gambling on coursing matches, increased. So that's an example of coevolution in action in history. I ended up thinking a lot about niches. Niche is a term that has been defined a number of ways. I ended up thinking that in history and coevolutionary history, the best definition I could develop was a job-habitat combination. By job, I do not mean only paid employment, though it includes that. I mean bundles of behaviors that are designed to achieve a particular goal. By habitat, I mean physical surroundings. On the right, you see an example of a niche. This is a forest in England in the 16th century. So that's the habitat. In fact, it's a managed habitat. It's in that middle ground between wild and constructed. And in it, you have two populations that are pursuing jobs. Both of them are hunting. They both have hunting jobs. In the background, you can see some dogs that were involved in hunting. Their job was to catch and pull down deer. And then the other population pursuing hunting jobs are the people. And there in the front, you can see one participant in it, actually several people. And we're observing at this moment a butchering ritual. The person who butchered the dead deer was expected to follow 30-some specific steps in a particular sequence. There were rules about who got which part of the deer and that sort of thing. So we have clear standards for behavior for the human hunters. We have behavioral expectations for the canine hunters. Both of them are working in the same habitat. So two jobs in the same habitat. And what this means is that people and domesticates co-construct niches. They make it possible for each other to do these things. Why is COVID-19 a great case study of coevolutionary history? It's for several reasons. One is that we have seen very rapid evolution and coevolution. The coronavirus populations have evolved very quickly. Human populations have evolved very quickly culturally. It's a large phenomenon. This is a global pandemic, and it's extraordinarily well documented. For coronavirus populations, we have a lot of information. We have had genetic sequence since early in the pandemic, and that sequencing continues, so we know a lot about the sequences of variants. We have a lot of data about the ecology of coronavirus. Ecology means distribution and abundance. We know about their evolution. We're tracking the development of variant populations with different traits that have different effects. And we have a lot of data on effects. How many people are infected? How many got sick? How many died? We also have a lot of data about people. We have statistics about disease and death. We have records of what kind of policies nations and localities have put into place. We have data on how people have behaved, both following and violating those policies and behaving in other ways that aren't governed by policies, but just are choices about what people will do. And we have a lot of data on experiences, what it has felt like to go through the coronavirus, COVID-19 epidemic. So lots of data. One of the interesting things among thousands is the way in which niche variation has led to trait variation. So on the right, you see a graph of death rates, deaths per million people in several countries. And the most important thing to see in that graph is that the curves are different. We see surges in most countries at about the same time, but the size of the surge is very different. Probably a number of variables contribute to that difference, but it seems clear that one of the most important variables is government policy. Countries that were strict about restricting movement and exposure experienced lower death rates than countries that were looser. So that highest ranking one is the United Kingdom, which had very loose regulations compared to other countries. Other countries like Canada had much lower rates. So we're going to have a lot of case studies to compare what scientists call natural experiments. And this is going to be a gold mine for future historians. COVID changed the way I think about coevolutionary history. Before COVID, when I was thinking about human evolution in historical time, I focused on human cultural evolution. There were several reasons for this. One was that this seemed far more important and documentable than genetic evolution in people in historical time. People change rapidly, culturally. They change their behaviors. These are made possible by genes, but not in any way determined by genes. People have the capacity to behave in a wide range of ways. They choose to behave in some of them and not to behave in others. I also wanted to stress that in talking about evolutionary history, I was not, contrary to the stereotype, I was not arguing for genetic determinism. There is a misconception that evolution or evolutionary ideas equal genetic determinism. This is false. It's not the way evolutionary biologists think. They think of evolution as a stochastic process that involves a lot of variables. And I wanted to emphasize how social forces have affected biological evolution, among other things. So, key idea here, I focused on, in people, cultural evolution. Here's an example on the left showing a coevolutionary sequence that follows that way I had been thinking. So we had a virus, we still do, a coronavirus that has a biological trait. It's highly contagious to people. People have evolved in response. Human populations increased the frequency of certain behaviors, such as social distancing and mask wearing. And the coronavirus populations have continued to evolve. It's unclear to what extent those human cultural behaviors may have influenced this, but we're seeing the emergence of variants that are more contagious, and it appears more deadly as well. So the virus continues to evolve. We'll have to figure out in the future how much it's in response to these cultural measures. We will have some of our better evidence if it turns out that some of the new variants are not stopped by the current vaccinations, but we'll have to see. The key point here is that for people, I was focusing on culture, but the COVID-19 epidemic made me see that people actually evolve culturally and biologically in historical time. To understand what I mean, I need to stress that biology does not equal genes. Genes are one aspect of biology, but biology includes lots of other processes. It includes ecology, it includes physiology, it includes anatomy. These are biology too, and biology includes behaviors. So, how have human beings evolved biologically in response to COVID? My first example is in antibodies. The frequency of antibodies to SARS-CoV-2, as the coronavirus is called, the level of antibodies is far higher today than it was a year ago. So the frequency of a biological trait has changed. That's true for me. You can see a photo taken when I was at the vaccination center earlier this week, getting my second vaccination. So what do we have? We have a coevolutionary sequence. We had some biological experiences with people getting ill. Human populations responded culturally by developing vaccinations. Use of those vaccinations then circled back to change human biological traits. The frequency of antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 are now much higher than they were a year ago. We have evolved biologically in historical time. What is interesting is that this change in trait frequency has not been equal among social groups, and there are many reasons for those differences. One that caught my attention grew out of an article in the New York Times a few days ago called "Least Vaccinated US Counties Have Something in Common: Trump Voters." What you have on this graph is a zero line. That zero line represents the national average vaccination rate. These bars represent vaccination rates in counties. So if the bar is above zero, it means the vaccination rate in counties is higher than the national average. If the bar is below the zero line, it means the vaccination rate is lower than the national average. These counties were categorized by voting in the last presidential election. So this bar represents counties that Biden carried by 20 percentage points or more. This one represents counties that Biden carried by 10 to 20%. This one represents counties that went for Trump or Biden by less than 10 points. This one represents counties that Trump carried by 10 to 20%. And this one, Trump counties that he carried by more than 20%. We see a striking contrast. Biden counties have a much higher vaccination rate than Trump counties. And that means the level of antibodies in Biden counties is much higher than in Trump counties. Now, this is not because of a genetic difference. This is because of behavioral differences. The vaccination rate is much higher in some counties than others because people are choosing to get vaccinated or not. And I am sure there are many variables that contribute to this difference, but one variable seems to be political ideology. Liberals in general have constructed a niche that says COVID is real. On the conservative side, many voices, by no means all, but many voices have said that COVID is a hoax. And as a result, people have approached COVID in very different ways. One of the easiest ways to picture the contrast is the behavior of the two presidential candidates. Joe Biden wore masks in public during the epidemic. Donald Trump did not. So we've got visible symbols of the difference in the relationship between ideology and behavior in relation to COVID. That in turn seems to have created sharply divergent levels in antibodies. So this is a variation in ideology that created variation in biology. I will mention that one possibility that would need to be examined is that it might well be that population density affects vaccination rates. We might expect that cities would get vaccinated faster than rural areas because you have large numbers of concentrated people in cities. You can vaccinate a lot of people quickly. In rural counties, it'd be much slower. We know that urban areas voted for Biden, rural areas voted for Trump. So that could be part of it. But I don't think it's all of it. At this point, what we have are anecdotes. The anecdotes are that the public health officials in Trump counties, the ones over here, are reporting a surplus of vaccines and a shortage of people willing to get vaccinated. So I'm sure there are multiple confounded variables, but it seems your ideology is playing an important role. Now let's turn to a second biological consequence of the COVID-19 epidemic. It has caused anxiety and depression to soar. Here are graphs of the rate. Before COVID, about 11% of Americans, adults, had anxiety and or depression in any given 2-week period. During the COVID pandemic, about 38% of American adults have had anxiety and or depression in a 2-week period. Those data were measured in October of 2020. So what we have is more than a tripling of rate of these diseases. Now, this means that it's probably affecting our members in significant ways. Our numbers of members go up and down, but let's assume 800 as an approximation. That means that at any given time outside the pandemic, we would predict that we'd have about 88 members who were suffering anxiety and or depression. During COVID, right now, we would estimate that we have about 300 members suffering anxiety and or depression. This is an enormous number. What it means is that the COVID pandemic has spawned a mental illness pandemic. It's a knock-on effect. So this is a striking example of one kind of pandemic creating another kind of pandemic, which I think is a very interesting phenomenon. Now, this increase in anxiety and depression is a biological change in populations. Some people believe that mental illness is just a way of thinking. It doesn't have any biological basis. And some then say it's not even really a disease. I think it's helpful to look at these brain scans to address that view. These PET scans show how active brains are. The light colored areas, and especially the orange areas, are areas of the brain that are very active. The dark colored areas are relatively inactive regions. You can see a clear contrast between the brain on the right and the brain on the left. Well, the difference is that the person whose brain that is on the right was not depressed. The person whose brain that was on the left was depressed. Depression lowers brain activity in measurable ways. It changes brain physiology in ways we can quantitatively document. This is a disease with a biological basis. These biological processes have symptomatic consequences. In depression, behaviors and emotions are both important. So depressed people often feel sad, hopeless, worthless. They have low energy, they lose sleep, they have suicidal thoughts and even attempts. And in some cases, those attempts are successful. Overall, about 7% of men who get depression end up killing themselves by suicide. That number is about 1% for women. It's important, though, to recognize that what we label as mental illness might not be all illness, might not be all deficit. Kay Redfield Jamison has done some of the most interesting research on depression and bipolar disorder. She has argued that very creative people are also often people who have had depression or bipolar disorder. And they have said that their creativity and their illness seems to, in some way, derive from a common root. So I think we need to look at this as a double-edged sword, that the same patterns of brain activity in some ways can generate creativity and also can generate pain and illness. I'm sure there's much more to it than this. This is just some of the key features. So how did COVID increase rates of mental illness? It's not a genetic change. People have not evolved genetically in the past year, so that's not a reason. In some cases, these people getting anxiety and depression seem to be getting it as a product of infection with COVID, especially people getting long COVID. And we have a lot more to learn about that, but some of them. But my experience is that that seems to be a minority of the people who are getting it. I am aware of adults and students who are getting anxiety and depression without any evidence that they were infected by COVID. So many, I would guess most of people experiencing this biological change are not doing it because of COVID directly, but rather indirectly. So how can COVID do this? We got this virus over there. If this virus is not even in the body of a person, how can it have this effect? I think the answer is that we have modified niches, job habitat combinations, in response to COVID in ways that exacerbate anxiety and depression. The habitat is different. We now have people working at home and isolating from each other. Isolation is difficult for people. We are a social species. We need each other and benefit from each other. That's one way. A second way is economics. A lot of people lost work or experienced a reduced income or were worried that they might lose their job or income. So that has exacerbated anxiety and stress. Another one is work-family balance. This can be hard to achieve at any time, but suddenly families had children home all the time, including children who would have been in school during the workday. Now you have people who are trying to do two jobs simultaneously in the same place. They're trying to manage their family and manage their work at the same time, which causes a great increase in stress. So I think most of this rise in rate of anxiety and depression is because of niche change. And what we're seeing is that a niche change has led to biological change. The experience of these two biological changes, antibody change and mental illness change, have been very different. They're both biological changes. They are both consequences of COVID, but we have treated them very differently. In the case of antibodies, we have created an admirable niche. We portray the getting of a vaccination as a public service. You will then not infect other people. We do them in public spaces. Remember the photo I showed you of the very public space where I got my vaccination. And therefore, we are very public about disclosure. In the center is a photograph of the button that I was given when I was vaccinated. They were asking us to button that button on our clothes to tell the whole world that we're vaccinated. We're advertising to the world that we've changed the frequency of our antibodies. So this is a very admirable niche, which leads to very public display of biological change, specifically antibody levels. Mental illness is the opposite. This niche has been constructed, it's not inherently, it's constructed as a shameful niche. We treat mental illness as a private burden. We treat it in private space, and we maintain secrecy. I know that a number of my students are suffering psychologically because of COVID and its effects, and I know other adults. Not one of them, to my knowledge, has disclosed this publicly. In my student's example, for example, in my student's case, for example, I'm teaching a course this semester comparing the flu epidemic with the COVID epidemic, and part of the course was writing essays about COVID experiences. A number of the students described psychological challenges, but when we came to discuss their experiences in class, I said, talk about only what you want. You're not expected to disclose anything you don't want. None of them revealed any psychological challenges to the other students. So I know they're suffering this, but they're keeping it secret. And that seems to be my impression of folks overall. So how do Americans stigmatize treatment? This is something people work at. It doesn't just happen. I think one of the best places to assess public attitudes is presidential campaigns. Campaigns are very careful to say and do what they think a majority of voters want to hear and see. So how have presidential campaigns treated treatment for mental illness? The first case that I remember clearly came when I was a teenager. That was the 1972 campaign. George McGovern was the Democratic nominee for president. He chose Missouri Senator Thomas Eagleton as his running mate. Eagleton seemed ideal. He was a relatively young man with an enormous list of accomplishments all the way by that time. So he seemed great, energetic, high performance levels, the kind of person that you would be happy to see in the presidency. But then someone leaked to the press the news that Eagleton had received treatment for a mental illness, sounds like it was depression, earlier. The public discussion reversed course. Before that rumor was leaked, the focus was on Eagleton's qualifications. As soon as news of a past treatment was leaked, the focus was on that treatment and potential mental illness, and past performance was forgotten. So there was a big controversy. And in this controversy, Eagleton could not win. Some people said that he should not be on the ticket because he's crazy and could not be trusted as president. Other people said, well, I don't really care that he got treatment, but it was really wrong of him to keep secret the fact that he has treatment, so he should not be president. In other words, the majority of Americans seem to believe that if you get one treatment for mental illness, you should be disqualified from ever holding high office. And I remember that there was a lot of mockery at the same time. I remember jokes about jumper cables being attached to Eagleton, to his head for the treatment. It was a lot of crude humor, but it was out in the open. So what happened? Eagleton was forced off the ticket. Sergeant Shriver ran with McGovern, and some of the McGovern people blamed Eagleton for his overwhelming loss in the general election. The 72 election set a tone that has persisted ever since. In 1988, Vice President H.W. Bush was running against Michael Dukakis. Ronald Reagan was the current president during the campaign. At one point, someone leaked a rumor that Dukakis had seen a therapist earlier in his life when his brother died. And that getting into the news led someone to ask Reagan in a public setting what he thought. Reagan replied, well, I'm not going to pick on an invalid. Picking on an, quote, unquote invalid was exactly, of course, what Reagan was doing. He was doing a couple things in a very few words. One is that he was saying that one past treatment made Dukakis a lifetime invalid. It didn't matter whether Dukakis was ill in reality at the time of the campaign. The assumption was once you were ill, you were always ill. Secondly, Reagan, who was nothing but somebody who knew how to make himself appealing, thought a lot of people would like to see mental illness mocked. So that was 1988. I call this principle, oh, let me back up. Dukakis dropped 5% overnight in the polls and lost the election. So it seems that Reagan and Bush were rewarded for mocking mental health treatment. These two experiences have led me to formulate what I call the lifetime disqualification principle. The principle is that if you ever get one treatment for mental illness, you are disqualified from ever having a high office in the future. The assumption seems to be that past treatment equals lifetime illness equals lifetime disqualification. Today, all campaigns follow the lifetime disqualification principle. The National Public Radio did a story on the Eagleton example and how much it has terrified campaigns ever since. And so they are careful never to put somebody with history of mental health treatment on the ballot. Well, I should say after Dukakis as well. But the NPR story was in the 1990s, I believe. And they were saying that campaigns were very aware of it today. I cannot actually say what's happening today. It may have changed, but I can say that in the past, that was the dominant rule of thumb. So how do Americans stigmatize treatment specifically through health insurance? Well, let's look at what insurance companies did before 2008. A lot of companies, if they covered mental health, and not all did, a lot of plans had separate and unequal benefits for mental illness versus other illnesses. A lot of plans had what were called carve-outs. The mental health carve-out meant that the people getting that kind of treatment needed to pay higher copays, and they would have lower lifetime benefits. So why treat mental illness differently? The argument was that it was unusually expensive, that people with mental illness would see the doctor frequently, and that would drive up costs in an unsustainable way. Now, the response was to have higher copays explicitly to deter people from getting treatment. This obviously is a short-sighted plan. Somebody who has active mental illness is going to cost the employer far more in lost productivity than the employer would pay for the treatment, but this is what people did. Okay, so we've got a claim by insurance companies before 2008 that mental illness is an unusually expensive disease, and therefore to cap runaway health costs, we need to limit mental health treatment. We then had a natural experiment. 2008, Congress passed the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act, which says that large health plans have to treat mental health and addiction like other illnesses. It's not all plans. Smaller plans are not covered, but for large plans, it did. So now we have data on people and how they behaved once discrimination was eliminated, at least in some plans. And what that shows is that mental health treatment accounts for about 5% of medical costs. On the left here, you can see costs ranked by condition, and all of these conditions contribute more to medical costs than mental illness, which is down here. It's there are only 3 below it and a lot above it. So this looks, if I were going to try to control costs, I would start here with the worst cost, the highest costs. And then I would go second here, and then third here, and then fourth. And then eventually I might get down here, but it doesn't make sense to start at a small cost area. If I want to control the big contributors, I should go up here. So why did insurance companies, whoops, didn't mean to advance that. So why did companies do that? Well, one possibility is that they are very bad at math. This is obviously untrue. Insurance companies have some of the best statisticians you could imagine. They depend on actuarial tables. So they have all kinds of mathematical expertise. Seems to me the real reason is probably a belief that people with mental illness are unworthy. They are inferior and do not deserve equal treatment. They deserve separate and unequal treatment. This is, of course, the same reasoning that led to segregation, and it's just the same. Some people are superior and deserve the highest level of goods and services. Other people are inferior and deserve less. And so I think that stigma is one of the biggest reasons. There also is another important reason, which is essentially political. On this list, the group of people least likely to complain about unequal treatment are people with mental illness. If somebody has a heart condition up here, this really expensive category, and their insurance company were to limit benefits in some way, that person, I am confident, or many of them, would openly complain. Same for almost all of these. But down here, mental illness, in fact, is different in this way. Because to complain about it is to out yourself. So people with mental illness were inclined to just stay silent about it and put up with unequal treatment in order to avoid self-outing. How about academics? Should we support neurodiversity? I think the answer is absolutely yes. The primary reason I would argue is simple humanity. We are all in this together. We should treat each other well. When people are sick, we should treat the illness. There's no reason to discriminate. So for me, that's a sufficient argument, but if you're interested in something more concrete, I have a list of those reasons too. One is that this is another aspect of diversity. We don't usually talk about it, but in fact, along with other kinds of diversity, neurodiversity is important. It's also common. Over a third of our members probably are neurodiverse right now. Another reason to be supportive is that as long as stigma survives, it deters people from getting treatment. Untreated illness hurts research, teaching, and service. So our field and our students are worse off. And in some cases, it kills people. We could see members die of untreated mental illness. Now, one thing I should be clear about is I am focusing on anxiety and depression as mental illness. They are only two of several kinds of mental illness. I'm using them in an illustrative way, not to imply that they are the whole universe. But I think we should pay attention to this issue for another reason, which is I think we actually exacerbate depression and anxiety because of the way we have constructed our niches. On the left, you see a cartoon by a graduate student who says, oh, I imagined wonderful life when I got into graduate school, but the bitter reality is that I feel attacked by journals, publish or perish, failed experiments. This is surely somebody from the sciences, problems with the supervisor, etc. So graduate school is deeply stressful. And life after graduate school is deeply stressful. You may or may not get a job. If you do get a job without being on the tenure track, you have a job uncertainty. If you're on the tenure track, you face about 6 years usually of uncertainty about whether you get to keep your job. I'm sure there's uncertainty in other categories of employment. I'm just less familiar with them personally, so I'm emphasizing what I do know more about. And in these niches, graduate student and early professional, we do a lot of things that make mental illness worse, anxiety and depression in particular. I think we do a lot of the same things that probably has contributed to the surge in rates under COVID. We in the humanities tend to work in isolation, so we're alone a lot of the time. We face a great deal of economic uncertainty. We don't know if we'll get a job. We don't know if we'll keep a job. If we are in graduate school or in a lot of jobs, we're making too little to support a family. And it's really hard to maintain a work-life balance. We ask people to go to graduate school and start their careers at exactly the same time of life when they're trying to find partners and start families, and that takes a lot of time and energy too. So we've got a lot of conflicting responsibilities. And then this uncertainty goes on a long time. If you're lucky enough to say go through grad school in 6 years and lucky enough to get a tenure track job right away, it's about 12 years where you're uncertain whether you're going to have a job or not. And for many people, it's longer. And for many job categories, there's even less certainty. So this is tough. These are conditions that if I were going to design an environment to promote anxiety and depression, these are exactly the variables I would build into that environment. We make things even worse by stigma. Okay, we've got all these environmental variables that are pushing people into anxiety and depression. And then what do? We stigmatize it. We force people to suffer privately because they're afraid of being revealed. And that and the stigma deters treatment. People don't want to be seen as mentally ill. They don't want to see themselves as mentally ill. And so the stigma multiplies the stresses already there. How do academics stigmatize neurodiversity? Well, partly it's individual and partly it's structural. Let me look at individual behaviors. My experience is that a few academics are supportive of people who face mental illness. Most are simply silent, but some are active stigmatizers. And I've heard several kinds of comments. Here are 3 of the ones that I think have been most cutting. What they have in common is blaming the victim. One is disdain. I have heard several academics say the only reason that anybody takes psychiatric medication is that they are afraid to face up to their problems. In other words, if they just had better character, if they were brave instead of cowardly, they would not have this illness. They could just move on. The second one is mockery. How many times have you heard somebody say, oh, she's off her meds, as if the only unreasonable people in the world are the mentally ill? Let's blame them for everything. We can scapegoat them for everything and mock them for it. Third is fear. In 2017, Philippa Levine and I organized the first session at an annual conference of the American Historical Association called Historians for Mental Health. Our goal was to create a space for historians to talk about challenges and solutions related to mental health. It was a wild success. There were about 30 people there. One senior historian told me it was the best conference event. Wasn't exactly a panel, it was a discussion, but best conference event he had ever attended. But that was countered for me by an AHA leader who tracked me down afterwards, having heard from a participant how wonderful this was. And this leader said to me, I'm worried about this. I'm afraid that if word gets out, it will reinforce the public view that all academics are crazy. So this image on the left seems to capture this leader's fears. Apparently, well, let me tell you what this photo is. This is a photo of an annual parade in a town in Mexico called the Parade of Crazy People. Once a year, people dress up in costumes, wear masks, and parade in the streets. And one of the ideas is that we're all a little bit crazy, and one day a year we let that out and vent. So clearly it's very popular, it's very colorful, and everybody's in it together. But it looks like what I was hearing from this AHA leader, was fear, that this leader thought the public already saw us like that crowd of people. And admitting that some of us might have mental illness would bring shame on everybody. So fear of contagious stigma, I heard voiced. I think about these things a lot because of my own experience. I have a history of depression with seasonal affective disorder. The latter means that in the winter, when days are short and gray, I am susceptible to depression. I've had this my whole career. I was diagnosed early in my assistant professorship. I treat it every day. You can see on the left 3 parts of my treatment, 3 technologies. One is the medication that I take to control my symptoms. The second is a bright light. That's what that white space is. It's a bright light that helps alleviate the symptoms of seasonal affective disorder. And then you see my running shoes. I run almost every day. I found that enormously helpful for mental health as well as physical health. I pay attention to a lot of other variables too. I take care to get a good night's sleep every night. That has an enormous impact. And I benefit enormously from family and friends. My family knows about this. My closest friends do. Most people don't. But the ones who do are deeply supportive, and that makes a big difference. Why have I not told anybody before today? My first psychiatrist said, never disclose this in a work environment. Why not? Because it can be used against you. So I got the impression, the belief that disclosing could ruin my career. How could it do that? Well, one is I was afraid that if my employer found out, they would deny me tenure. My psychiatrist said that people are not fired because of mental illness per se. Employers instead find a pretext. And I was really worried about getting tenure. I think most people on the tenure track are. So this exacerbated my worry that I had a trait that if my employer discovered it, could be used against me. Another fear was that if I ever wanted another job, let's say I got tenure there, but let's say I wanted to move somewhere, if mental illness was a publicly known fact, it might keep me from getting a job elsewhere. What would stop that AHA letter, someone like that AHA leader, from being a dean somewhere and looking at 3 well-qualified candidates in a finalist pool and saying, oh, I hear Russell's a nutcase. I'm not going to have him. I have enough difficult faculty already. So it just seemed that there was no upside to disclosing. There's another reason too. I had no role model, not a single one. I did not know of a single historian who had publicly disclosed a mental illness and had a successful career. Now, I saw a couple possibilities for that pattern. One pattern was that mental illness ruined their careers. They were so disabled that they washed out of the profession. The other was that they recognized the risks were too high and stayed silent. I suspected it was the second one, but that taught me the safest strategy that others seem to have settled on was to keep silent. The effect of this was to create what I call terror of outing, which has characterized my career for 30 years. I have lived in terror that someone somehow might out me, that it would ruin my career. If it didn't hurt me in the short run, it might foreclose future possibilities. And I worried that you would think less of me. So why disclose today? I've worked so hard to keep this secret. What's different about today? One reason is that we have a crisis. If we have about 300 members, we have a crisis. If 300 members who are experiencing anxiety and depression, that's a crisis. Plus, we probably have members with other mental illnesses too. I don't know the exact numbers. It could be 100, it could be 400. The point is, I'm confident we have members who are facing this, and it's a difficult problem for them, and that makes it a difficult problem for us. A second reason is that I am at a different career stage than I was earlier. And in my current career stage, I face much lower risks than I would have earlier. I am a chaired professor with tenure at a university I like and plan to finish my career working for. And so I'm less worried about future opportunities. That status of my career is reflected on the left. This is a photo of a chair that Carnegie Mellon gave me in conjunction with the ceremony in investing me with this endowed chair. So I am a chaired professor with a chair, and I just love the symbolism of making a chair concrete and specific. But that symbolizes some stability that other people don't have. Third, I am tired of the stress. The closet is a small space and it's exhausting to live in it. It makes my life have narrower boundaries and raises my worry. Another reason is I want to tell all ASEH members that treatment works. I have been able to build a career that I love, despite having been diagnosed with depression, and you can too. Finally, I see today and this talk as a unique opportunity. I don't expect to give any other presidential addresses in my career, and I thought this was my best chance out of my entire career to reach a wide audience of both people affected and not affected, but part of the community, and explain how my experience informs the way I hope we can all think about mental illness and its role in our society. So here's my message to those who might be suffering from any mental illness. The first one is you're not alone. When I was diagnosed, I felt completely alone. The only person I told at first was my wife. And I felt I could not talk to anybody, which means I could not have any support from anybody. And it put a lot of just a lot of burden on the couple people I was talking to, my psychiatrist and my wife. And what you need to, and I felt uniquely sick. I did not know anybody else, any other historian who had this condition. And I wasn't very knowledgeable about rates of disease. And I just felt uniquely flawed and alone. Secondly, what I want you to hear and internalize is that you have a disease, not a character flaw. This is not your fault. You didn't get this because you're a bad person. You got a disease. Third, all diseases are the product of body-environment interactions. And that's true here too. One of my big hopes for a benefit of the COVID epidemic is that people will look and see we tripled the rate of anxiety and depression during the COVID epidemic. People hadn't changed that much, but a lot more people are sick. It looks like environment has a big impact on the frequency of this disease. Maybe we should pay attention to our environments and how we construct niches and what impact that has on human health. Another message. I value you. We value you. If you are in ASEH, you are part of the family. I and we want you to stay part of the family. As I mentioned before, my experience is that treatment works. I hope that you will get treatment if you need it. I want to say that my experience is that I was able to build a career. I really worried in two ways. As I stressed before, I was worried that outing would ruin my career, but I also worried about disability. I remember thinking that I was in a position like a professional baseball pitcher who just had a bad injury to his arm and was worrying whether that was going to end his career because he could not pitch as well ever since. I was thinking, well, what is, if we think arm is to pitching, what organ is to being a professor? So it's arm is to pitcher as brain is to professor. So I was worried my brain was broken and it would disable me and I would wash out of the profession because I was disabled. So that was a source of stress too. My message is that you can build a career and be successful also. I support you. That's my message. I support you. I want you in ASEH. I want you to stay in ASEH. This is a long, difficult journey. I know I've walked in your shoes. Mine are well worn, but it can be a successful journey. So how can we make things better? Well, I think we can do things as individuals as well as in the form of institutional change. As individuals, we can challenge comments when somebody says, oh, she's off her meds. Say something. Don't just go along with stigmatizing people. We can also support individuals. I want to make clear that I'm not talking about being somebody's therapist, but we can say supportive, helpful things. So we can ask people how they're doing. If they describe difficulty, all you have to say is that sounds really hard. You shouldn't diagnose. You shouldn't prescribe treatment. What I often say to students, and I hear from a lot of them, I say, that sounds really hard. Do you feel you have the support you need to go through this difficult time? And then if they're comfortable, they can tell me they're seeing a therapist or not. So the important thing is don't feel you need to be the therapist. Just let people know that you support them getting treatment and you want them to succeed. And that's another message I send to my students who are struggling. I say, look, I want you to succeed. I want you to pass this class. Thirdly, I think we can do more in research and teaching, which are individual choices, but boy, I'd love to see an environmental history of seasonal affective disorder. It seems like a great environmental history. And we can do more in our teaching. At Carnegie Mellon, we are including statements about mental health in our syllabi. I imagine that's true in a lot of universities. It's a great practice if you're not already doing it. What about the institutional level? Well, I have observed a great dichotomy. Universities now are talking a lot about helping students who suffer from mental illness, but talk far less about faculty and staff, as though students are the only ones suffering. But I expect the rates are roughly similar. And it would be helpful for some leaders to say, we know all of you are struggling. We want you to succeed. We value you as faculty and staff. And we want to be supportive. In fact, a lot of universities have employee assistance programs. They're not always well advertised, but they can help you if you can't find help through your physician. Those places exist to do it, and a number of them promise confidentiality. I would also encourage leaders, presidents, provosts, deans, to move from tolerance to affirmation. The de facto policy in higher education is don't ask, don't tell. We'll tolerate you, but we don't want to know. And that's better than active stigma. Some places, if you read the Chronicle of Education, during my career, some places have actively discriminated against students and others with mental illness. But that, I think most are in a tolerance mode, which is fine, but we can do better. We can affirm people and say, we value you. You belong here. We want you to stay. We would be worse off if we were to lose you. We can not modify niches. I think it's time to take a look at how we do graduate school and assistant professorships and other work environments and think about their mental health consequences. I do a little bit of this. I recognized early in my advising career that there was a big change in graduate education from the course stage to the dissertation research stage. In the course stage, graduate students saw their friends frequently. At the dissertation stage, they suddenly were working alone. And at that point, I decided to start discussion groups of all my advisees and any other students who wanted to attend, and they were held about every 2 weeks. At first, the students felt like this was just one more obligation that they resented, but it quickly became common, and students who were advised by a lot of other professors joined us. And I never said this is for your mental health. In fact, it served a lot of purposes, but that was one of them. Accommodations. Most universities have accommodations policies, but they may not be well publicized. Mental illness, in fact, is protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. If I were thinking about it, I would think about this as a last resort. I suspect that in many cases it would not need to be invoked, but you should be aware of that. And I would like to see societies do more. The Historians for Mental Health was a great panel, great success at the AHA conference. I'm talking about this as president. Maybe some other societies want to be more explicit about the way they value and support diversity, neurodiversity. In conclusion, I have suggested that COVID-19 and its epidemic provides us with the best case study we have so far of coevolution, and that we and the coronavirus populations have co-evolved, that the coronavirus has evolved genetically, biologically, and people have evolved both culturally and biologically, not genetically, but in other ways. The two ways I identified were change in frequency of antibodies and change in frequency of anxiety and depression. So we've increased our neurodiversity over the past year as a consequence of COVID. We have responded in dichotomous ways to those two biological changes. We could have decided to treat them symmetrically. Oh, these are both biological consequences of COVID. Let's just say they're both equally understandable. But we don't, because those niches were largely pre-constructed before COVID arrived. Vaccination is not something we're ever ashamed of, at least not in most circles, I believe. I know there are some that are deeply opposed, but schools have been requiring vaccinations for a long time, and it's considered routine, not something to distinguish you in any way. Whereas we have stigmatized mental illness and mental illness treatment, and that has made us have the antibody niche be very public and open, and the mental illness niche to be closed and secretive. We need cultural evolution. We can do better. These niches are not inherent. They are human choices that we have made in the past. They're not going to change overnight. People have been hammering some really sturdy beams in there, but we can make some changes. And what I hope is anybody who's struggling will know that I journey with you. This is a journey, and it's a difficult journey. I know that very, very well. It's often a painful journey. Sometimes it feels hopeless. The shoes I've been wearing are worn through in places, but I'm still journeying, and I journey alongside you. You're not alone. And then finally, I want all of us to journey together. We are the American Society for Environmental History. We're not the American individuals for environmental history. As a society, we have obligations to each other. We need to support each other. That's the reason for an organization. We do not have a tradition of trying to support each other for people with neurodiversity, but we're welcoming all kinds of diversity, and this is just another kind of diversity. So let's all pitch in. Let's be a little more tolerant today than we were yesterday. Let's see where we might have opportunities to open some conversations. Let's see where we might be able to just say something nice to somebody who seems to be struggling. All of these little things add up. Individual change plus institutional change can matter. I hope this talk pushes us a little bit farther down that road towards progress. And I hope that all of ASEH will join us in that journey. Thank you. I will now welcome questions.